This is the story of Clara, a woman who lived for years under the shadow of her wealthy and condescending in-laws, the Whitmans, who dismissed her as common and classless. Little did they know, Clara was quietly acquiring their family's legacy from the inside out, turning their arrogance into her own absolute power. It is a compelling tale of patience, silent triumph, and the moment a woman stops playing a part to become the true owner of her own destiny. The chandeliers of the grand Sterling ballroom dripped with light, each crystal prism scattering rainbows across the silk-covered tables and the polished marble floor. It was the kind of room designed to make people feel small. The towering ceilings, the gilded moldings, the portraits of dead Whitmans lining the walls, their painted eyes following the living with expressions of perpetual, genteel disapproval. Clara had been coming to the Whitman and Company annual gala for 5 years now, and she still felt, every time she walked through those gilded doors, like she was entering a museum where she was both the least valuable exhibit and the one under the harshest light. She stood near the bar, a glass of champagne in her hand, untouched, because she had learned early in her marriage that Beatrice Whitman counted every sip her daughter-in-law took and filed it away as evidence of either abstinence, prudish, or indulgence, common. The champagne was a prop, a costume piece, like the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. It was one of the firm's signature pieces, a cascade of brilliant cut stones set in platinum, designed by Beatrice's own grandfather in 1923. Clara had been given it to wear tonight by Beatrice herself, a gesture that might have seemed generous if not for the accompanying note. Please ensure it is returned to the vault by midnight. It is not a gift. Clara had smiled when she read the note. She had smiled when she clasped the necklace around her throat. She had smiled when she walked into the ballroom on her husband's arm, her dark hair swept up in a simple twist, her gown a deep sapphire blue that made her eyes look almost violet. She had learned over 5 years of marriage to Alexander Whitman that smiling was the only armor that Beatrice couldn't penetrate. Beatrice could dismiss tears as weakness, anger as vulgarity, silence as stupidity. But a smile, a calm, steady, impenetrable smile, left her nothing to work with, and Clara had become very good at smiling. The ballroom was crowded with the usual collection of Whitman and Company luminaries, board members in dark suits, their wives in designer gowns, all of them orbiting Beatrice like planets around a dying sun. Beatrice herself was holding court at the center table, a woman in her late 60s with iron-gray hair swept into an elaborate coiffure and a figure that had been preserved through decades of disciplined denial. She wore the firm's most famous piece, the Whitman Star, a 40-carat sapphire surrounded by a halo of diamonds, a stone that had once belonged to a Russian Grand Duchess and had been acquired by Beatrice's grandfather under circumstances that were never discussed in polite company. Alexander was beside his mother, his hand resting on the back of her chair, his face arranged in the expression of attentive devotion that Clara had once mistaken for love. She knew better now. Alexander's devotion was not to his mother, nor to his wife, nor to anyone but the careful, comfortable life that had been arranged for him since birth. He was a handsome man, tall, blond, with the kind of features that aged well and the kind of mind that never questioned anything it had been taught. Clara had married him believing she loved him. She had since learned that what she had loved was the idea of being chosen by someone so effortlessly golden, so completely at home in a world that had always made her feel like an intruder. She didn't love him anymore. She wasn't sure she ever had, but she had stayed through the cold dinners and the colder silences, through the subtle cruelties of his mother and the indifferent neglect of his father, through the slow, grinding realization that she had traded her own ambition for a place at a table where she would never truly be welcome. She had stayed because of Whitman and Company, because 2 years ago, when the firm had been on the brink of collapse, she had been the one to save it. The crisis had begun quietly, as crises often do. Whitman and Company had been losing money for years, bleeding it, really, through outdated supply chains and inefficient manufacturing. and a stubborn refusal to acknowledge that the world had changed. The board, composed of elderly men who had been appointed by Beatrice's father and who viewed change as a personal affront, had responded to declining revenues by cutting costs in the most destructive ways possible. Cheaper materials, reduced quality, layoffs among the artisans who had been with the firm for generations. The result was predictable. The jewelry became shoddy. The reputation, built over a century, began to tarnish, and the vultures began to circle. Clara had seen it coming. She had no formal role at Whitman and Company. Beatrice had made it clear that family did not mean employee, and that Clara's place was at home, supporting her husband. But Clara had spent her 20s building a career in logistics and supply chain management before she met Alexander, and she hadn't forgotten how to read a balance sheet. She had watched the numbers month after month and felt the cold, certain dread of a woman who could see the iceberg but couldn't convince anyone to change course. So she had stopped trying to convince them. She had simply acted. She had spent 6 months working in secret, analyzing the firm's supply chain, identifying inefficiencies, sourcing new vendors, negotiating contracts. She had done it all from the small home office that Beatrice dismissed as Clara's little hobby room, working late into the night while Alexander slept. When she finally presented her plan to the board, it was complete, a comprehensive restructuring that would cut costs by 30% while improving quality, modernizing the manufacturing process, and preserving the artisans' jobs. The board had been stunned. Beatrice had been furious, but the numbers didn't lie, and the alternative was bankruptcy. They had implemented Clara's plan. Within 18 months, Whitman and Company was profitable again. The vultures retreated. The century-old firm was saved, and Beatrice had never forgiven her for it. Now, 2 years later, Clara stood at the edge of the ballroom, her untouched champagne warming in her hand, and watched her mother-in-law rise from the center table and glide toward her. Beatrice moved through a crowd the way a shark moves through water, effortlessly, inevitably, and with the absolute certainty that everything in her path would part before her. "Clara, dear," Beatrice's voice was warm, almost tender, the voice she used when she was about to deliver a blow. "You look comfortable tonight. That color is very forgiving, isn't it?" Clara's smile didn't waver. "Thank you, Beatrice. You look lovely as always. The Whitman star is breathtaking." Beatrice's hand rose to touch the sapphire at her throat, a gesture of possessive pride. "Yes, it is. It takes a certain kind of woman to wear a stone like this, a certain presence, a certain pedigree." Her eyes swept over Clara's gown, her simple jewelry, her quiet composure. "But you do your best with what you have, dear. I have always admired that about you." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a murmur that was nevertheless pitched to carry to the board members seated nearby. "You can wear the diamonds, Clara. You can stand in this room and smile and pretend you belong. But you lack the pedigree. You simply aren't classy enough for the Whitman name. It's a shame my son didn't choose a peer, someone who understood what it means to be part of a legacy, rather than someone who merely manages it." The words hung in the air, delicate and devastating. The board members at the nearby table, 3 men in dark suits, their faces carefully neutral, had clearly heard every syllable. One of them, a man named Harrington, who had been on the board for 30 years, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The others looked away, their eyes fixed on their plates or their glasses, anywhere but at Clara. Beatrice smiled, a warm, gracious smile, the smile of a woman who had just performed a necessary duty. "Enjoy the rest of the evening, dear, and do remember to return the necklace to the vault. It's not a piece for everyday wear." She turned and glided back to her table, the Whitman star blazing at her throat like a captured piece of the sky. Clara stood very still. The champagne glass was warm in her hand. The diamond necklace was cool against her skin. Around her, the ballroom hummed with conversation and laughter. and the clink of silver against china. No one looked at her. No one acknowledged what had just happened. They had all heard, and they had all chosen, in the way of people who had spent their lives navigating the treacherous waters of Whitman family politics, to pretend they hadn't. She was alone in a room full of people. She had been alone for 5 years. She set the champagne glass on a passing tray. She walked slowly and deliberately to the ladies' lounge. The room was empty, all marble and gilt and soft lighting. She stood before the mirror and looked at her reflection, the sapphire gown, the diamond necklace, the calm, composed face of a woman who had learned to smile through anything. She reached up and unclasped the necklace. She held it in her hands, the platinum setting, the brilliant cut stones, the century of Whitman legacy pressing against her palms. It was beautiful. It was valuable. It was nothing compared to what she had given this family. She thought about the supply chain she had rebuilt, the bankruptcy she had prevented, the jobs she had saved, the late nights in her little hobby room, working while her husband slept, while her mother-in-law dismissed her, while an entire family of inherited wealth looked at her and saw only her lack of pedigree. She thought about Beatrice's words. "You lack the pedigree. You simply aren't classy enough for the Whitman name." And for the first time in 5 years, Clara stopped smiling. She looked at her reflection, at the woman she had become, the woman she had always been, the woman who had saved a century-old firm with nothing but her own intelligence and determination. And she felt something shift inside her. Not break, shift. Like a gear clicking into place, like a lock finally turning after years of being jammed. Beatrice was right. She wasn't classy enough for the Whitman name. She was something far more valuable. She was competent. She was capable. She was the reason this firm still existed. The reason Beatrice could still wear the Whitman star and preside over galas and pretend that the world hadn't changed. And she was done. She placed the diamond necklace on the marble counter. She didn't return it to the vault. She simply left it there, a glittering rejection of everything it represented. Then she walked out of the lounge, out of the ballroom, out of the hotel, and into the cool night air. She didn't go home. She went to her office, the small, unassuming space she had rented 6 months ago, when she first began to understand that her marriage was a cage and she needed to start building a door. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and began to type. The document was titled Whitman and Company, Hostile Acquisition Strategy. She worked through the night. The sun rose over the city, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. And Clara, the unrefined bride, the woman who lacked pedigree, the woman who had been told she wasn't classy enough for the Whitman name, began to plan the dismantling of an empire. She wasn't just going to leave her husband. She wasn't just going to divorce the Whitman family. She was going to take everything they valued most and make it her own. And she was going to do it with a smile. The morning after the gala, Clara woke in her own bed for the last time. She had not returned to the house on Willow Lane until nearly dawn, her mind still humming with the architecture of her plan. Alexander was asleep when she slipped into the bedroom. He had come home hours earlier, she knew, because his tuxedo was draped over the chair and his shoes were kicked off by the closet. He hadn't called her. He hadn't texted. He hadn't noticed she was gone. He had simply assumed she would be there when he woke, the way he had assumed everything about their marriage, that she would be present, patient, and perpetually available to support the life he had been given without ever having to earn it. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at him in the pale light of early morning. His blonde hair was tousled against the pillow. His face, in sleep, was soft and unguarded. The face of a man who had never been truly tested, never been forced to fight for anything. She had loved that face once, or she had believed she loved it. Now she understood that what she had loved was the idea of being chosen by someone so effortlessly golden, so completely at home in a world that had always made her feel like an outsider. She didn't love him anymore. She wasn't sure she ever had, but she had learned from him. She had learned how power worked in his world, not through confrontation, but through quiet accumulation. not through scenes, but through signatures. The Whitmans didn't shout. They didn't fight. They simply owned things. They owned buildings and businesses and legacies, and they used those possessions to shape the world around them without ever raising their voices. Clara had decided to become a Whitman in the only way that mattered, on paper. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in her home office, the little hobby room Beatrice dismissed, and reviewed the documents she had assembled over the past 2 years. The file was thick, its contents organized with the same meticulous precision she had brought to the supply chain restructuring. Every contract, every amendment, every quiet negotiation conducted while the Whitman family was distracted by galas and gossip and the comfortable assumption that Clara was simply a supportive wife with a knack for logistics. The truth was far more interesting. When Clara had first identified the crisis at Whitman and Company, she had not rushed to present her findings. She had waited. She had let the situation deteriorate, watched the board flail, watched Beatrice issue imperious directives that only made things worse, watched Alexander nod along with his mother's every word because he had never learned to do anything else. She had let them feel the full weight of their own incompetence. And then, when they were desperate, when the banks were circling and the vultures were gathering, she had offered her help, but not for free. The negotiation had taken place in a private conference room at the offices of Whitman and Company, with only Clara, the family's longtime attorney, and a single representative from the board present. Beatrice had refused to attend, declaring it unseemly for the family to negotiate with one of its own. Alexander had been there, but he had spent the entire meeting scrolling through his phone, glancing up only when his name was mentioned. He had trusted Clara to handle the details. He had always trusted her to handle the details. The attorney, a man named Hargrove, who had served the Whitman family for 40 years, had been the one to voice the terms. "Mrs. Whitman," he had said, his voice carefully neutral, "the family is prepared to accept your restructuring proposal in exchange for your expertise and the personal capital you've offered to inject. We are willing to grant you a 20% stake in the holding company. This is a generous offer, given your position, the wife, the outsider, the woman who had married into the family and should therefore be grateful for any crumbs they chose to offer." Clara had smiled. It was the same calm, steady smile she had worn at the gala, the smile that revealed nothing. 20% is not sufficient. I want a majority stake, 51%, and a performance-based ownership clause that vests immediately upon the company's return to profitability. I also want preferred creditor status for the capital I'm injecting. If the company fails despite my efforts, I will be first in line to recover my investment. Hargrove had blinked. Alexander had looked up from his phone, his brow furrowing. "Clara, that's not reasonable. The family would never agree to—" "The family is about to lose everything," Clara had said. Her voice was quiet, unhurried, the voice of a woman stating facts, not making demands. "The banks will call in their loans within 60 days. The board is in open revolt. 3 major clients have already signaled their intention to terminate their contracts. Without my capital and my restructuring plan, Whitman and Company will be in bankruptcy by the end of the quarter. The family will lose not just the company, but the houses, the cars, the art, the jewelry, everything." She had paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I am offering you a way to keep the Whitman name alive. I am offering you a way to preserve the legacy Beatrice talks about so often. But I am not a charity. I am an investor, and investors require a return. 51%, preferred creditor status, performance-based vesting, those are my terms. You have 48 hours to accept them." She had stood, gathered her papers, and walked out of the room. Alexander had followed her, his face a mask of confusion and the first stirrings of something that might have been fear. "Clara, you can't just— My mother will never—" "Your mother," Clara had said, not breaking stride, "has spent 5 years treating me like a stain on her silk. She has called me common, unrefined, and lacking in pedigree. She has made it clear that I will never truly be a Whitman. Fine, I accept that. But if I'm not a Whitman, then I am something else. I am the woman who is about to save your family from its own incompetence, and I will be compensated accordingly. She had walked out of the building and into the pale winter light, her heart pounding, her hands steady. She had not looked back. 46 hours later, Hargrove had called. The family had accepted her terms. The documents Clara reviewed that night told the full story. There was the amended operating agreement for Whitman Holdings, LLC, the parent company that controlled Whitman and Company and all its assets. The agreement listed Clara as the majority shareholder with 51% of the voting shares. Alexander held 15%, a stake he had inherited from his grandfather. Beatrice held 12%. The remainder of what had once been a controlling interest, diluted over the years by poor decisions and the slow erosion of the family's fortune. The rest was held by the board and a handful of outside investors. There was the performance-based vesting schedule Clara had insisted upon. The moment Whitman and Company returned to sustained profitability, a milestone it had achieved 18 months ago, Clara's shares became fully vested and non-dilutable. She could not be voted out. She could not be bought out without her consent. She was, for all practical purposes, the sole controlling owner of the company the Whitmans had spent a century building. And then there was the preferred creditor agreement. Clara had injected $2.7 million of her own capital into the firm, money she had saved and invested over the course of her career, money the Whitmans had assumed came from Alexander or from some modest inheritance. The agreement stipulated that in the event of any liquidation, sale, or restructuring, Clara's investment would be repaid before any other creditor, including the banks. She was first in line. She was the safest bet in a company built on risk. Beatrice had signed the documents herself. Clara remembered the moment clearly. Beatrice in Hargrove's office, her face pinched with distaste, her pen moving across the pages without reading them. She had trusted Hargrove to protect the family's interests. She had trusted that Clara was simply a wife who helped out, a temporary inconvenience who would fade into the background once the crisis was past. She had signed away control of her family's legacy without ever understanding what she was doing, because Beatrice didn't read contracts. Beatrice attended galas and wore diamonds and pronounced judgments on other women's pedigrees. Beatrice believed that power was something you were born with, not something you acquired through careful, patient, methodical work. Beatrice was wrong. Clara closed the file as the first light of dawn crept through the window. She had not slept. She was not tired. She was filled with a cold, clear energy, the energy of a woman who had spent years being underestimated and was finally ready to stop pretending. She showered and dressed in a simple gray suit, elegant but understated, the kind of armor that whispered rather than shouted. She packed a small bag with her essentials, the file of documents, her laptop, a change of clothes, the small wooden box containing her mother's pearl earrings, and a photograph of the two of them in the garden. She left her engagement ring and her wedding band on the nightstand beside Alexander's sleeping form. He wouldn't notice them until she was gone. He might not notice them even then. She walked out of the house on Willow Lane for the last time. The hydrangeas her mother-in-law had insisted on planting. Beatrice had opinions about everything. Even flowers she never tended were blooming in shades of pale blue and white. Clara didn't look at them. She got into her car and drove away. The offices of Whitman and Company occupied the top 3 floors of a historic building downtown, a limestone edifice with the company name carved above the entrance in elegant gold lettering. Clara had always felt like an intruder here, a guest in someone else's house. Today, for the first time, she walked through the revolving doors with the quiet certainty of a woman who owned the place, because she did. She rode the elevator to the executive floor in silence. The receptionist, a young woman named Elise, who had always been kind to Clara even when the rest of the staff followed Beatrice's lead, looked up with a smile. "Mrs. Whitman, good morning. Is there something I can help you with?" "Good morning, Elise." Clara's voice was calm, unhurried. I need access to the boardroom, and I need you to schedule a meeting with the full board and the Whitman family shareholders today, if possible, this afternoon." Elise blinked. "The full board? Mrs. Whitman, that's quite short notice. Mrs. Whitman Sr. has a very full calendar, and Mr. Alexander is—" "Mrs. Whitman Sr. will attend," Clara said, "and so will Alexander. Tell them it's a mandatory shareholders meeting, called by the majority shareholder. They'll understand." Elise's eyes widened. She had been with the company for 3 years. She understood enough to know what those words meant. "Yes, Mrs. Whitman, I'll make the calls immediately." Clara nodded and walked past her, down the corridor to the boardroom. It was empty, the long mahogany table gleaming under the soft lights, the portraits of dead Whitmans lining the walls. She stood at the head of the table, the seat that had always been reserved for Beatrice, for Alexander, for the men who had inherited their power rather than earning it. She didn't sit, not yet. She simply stood there, her hands resting on the back of the chair, and looked at the portraits. The painted eyes stared back at her with expressions of perpetual, genteel disapproval. "You lack the pedigree," Beatrice had said. "You simply aren't classy enough for the Whitman name." Clara smiled. It was the same smile she had worn at the gala, the same smile she had worn when she negotiated her majority stake, the same smile she had worn for 5 years while the family she had saved treated her like an embarrassment. "You're right," she said aloud, to the portraits, to the empty room, to the ghost of every Whitman who had ever looked at her and seen only her lack. "I'm not classy enough for your name, but I'm smart enough to own everything that name built. And by the end of today, you're all going to understand exactly what that means." She pulled out the chair and sat down. The leather was cool and smooth. The table stretched before her, vast and gleaming. Outside the window, the city hummed with the sound of 1,000,000 lives being lived, indifferent to the small drama about to unfold in a boardroom above the streets. Clara opened her file and began to review her notes. The meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock. That gave her 6 hours to prepare. She had waited 5 years. She could wait 6 more hours. The discovery came on a Tuesday afternoon, in the most mundane way possible. Clara was in her office at Whitman & Company, not the little hobby room Beatrice dismissed, but a real office on the executive floor, one she had claimed quietly 6 months ago, while the family was distracted by a charity gala and a minor scandal involving a board member's indiscreet emails. She had been reviewing the quarterly financials, her eyes moving down the columns of numbers with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years learning to read the stories money told. And then she saw it, a series of withdrawals from the company's discretionary fund. Not large enough to trigger the automated alerts, Julian was too careful for that, but regular, monthly, each one labeled with the same vague notation, "Client Development, Entertainment." The amounts varied, but the pattern was unmistakable. Over the past 14 months, nearly $200,000 had been siphoned out of the company in small, careful increments, and every single withdrawal had been authorized by Julian Whitman. Clara sat very still. The numbers on the screen didn't change. The office hummed with the quiet, indifferent sounds of the building, the ventilation, the distant murmur of voices, the soft click of a keyboard somewhere down the hall. She stared at the screen and felt something inside her chest go cold. Not with shock. She had stopped being shocked by Julian's weaknesses years ago, but with a terrible, crystalline clarity. This was the final piece, the thing that would make everything else inevitable. She didn't confront him immediately. That wasn't her way. Instead, she spent the next 3 days conducting a quiet, methodical investigation. She traced the withdrawals to a series of payments: a luxury hotel in the city, a private dining club, a jewelry boutique that specialized in pieces for discerning clients. She found the receipts buried in expense reports that Julian had signed himself, counting on the fact that no one at Whitman & Company ever questioned a Whitman. She found the name Margot Delacour, a socialite who moved in the same circles as Beatrice, a woman whose pedigree was impeccable and whose reputation for discretion was legendary among the kind of people who needed such things. And she found the photographs. They had been taken by a private investigator she hired through a trusted contact, a woman who specialized in marital asset protection and who asked no questions. The photos showed Julian and Margot together, at the hotel, at the restaurant, walking arm in arm through a quiet park. In one of them, Margot was wearing a diamond bracelet that Clara recognized. It was a Whitman and Company piece, a one-of-a-kind design that had been listed in the company's inventory as on loan to a private client. There was no record of any loan agreement. Julian had simply taken it from the vault and given it to his mistress. Clara looked at the photographs for a long time. She didn't cry. She had stopped crying over Julian years ago. Around the same time, she had stopped believing that his indifference was something she could fix by being better, thinner, more accomplished, more classy. She had tried all of that. She had saved his family's company. She had worn the diamonds and smiled at the galas and absorbed his mother's cruelties without flinching, and none of it had mattered because Julian didn't want a partner. He wanted an audience, and Clara had never been willing to applaud loudly enough. She closed the file. She made a single phone call to her attorney, confirming that the documents she had prepared months ago were still in order. Then she went home to wait. The confrontation happened that evening. Clara had chosen the setting carefully, the formal living room of the house on Willow Lane, a space so pristine and impersonal it felt like a stage set. The furniture was expensive and uncomfortable, chosen by Beatrice years ago and never changed. The art on the walls was valuable but soulless, landscapes and portraits acquired for their investment potential rather than their beauty. It was the perfect room for what was about to happen. Julian arrived at 7, as she had requested. He looked annoyed. He had been at the club, he said, and didn't appreciate being summoned home like a child. Clara listened to his complaints without responding. She simply gestured to the chair across from her and waited for him to sit. "What's this about, Clara?" His voice was tight, impatient. "If this is about the gala next week, I already told Mother you'd wear the sapphire set. She wasn't happy about it, but I managed her. You're welcome." Clara looked at him, at the handsome golden man she had married, believing, hoping, that beneath the surface there was something worth loving. She had been wrong. She had been wrong about so many things. "It's not about the gala," she said. Her voice was calm, quiet, the voice of a woman who had already traveled through the fire and emerged on the other side. "It's about Margot Delacour and the $200,000 you've taken from the company to fund your affair with her." The color drained from Julian's face. For a moment, just a moment, he looked like a man who had been caught. Then his expression shifted, hardening into something defensive, almost angry. "I don't know what you're talking about. Margot is a family friend. Mother adores her. If you've been going through my things, Clara, I have to say that's incredibly. I have receipts." Clara's voice didn't rise. "I have bank records. I have photographs. I have a complete accounting of every dollar you've stolen from the company your family has spent a century building. And I have the inventory record for the diamond bracelet you gave her, the one that's still listed as on loan in the vault, even though it's been sitting on Margot Delacour's wrist for the past 6 months." She reached into the folder beside her and withdrew a single photograph. She slid it across the coffee table. Julian stared at it, the image of him and Margot at the hotel, his arm around her waist, her face tilted up toward his with an expression of intimate familiarity. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely a whisper. "That doesn't matter. What matters is what happens next." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "I'm going to give you a choice, Julian. You can resign from Whitman and Company quietly, effective immediately. You can sign a confession acknowledging the embezzlement and the affair, which will be kept confidential unless you violate the terms of our divorce. And you can walk away from this marriage with whatever personal assets you brought into it, which is more than you deserve." Julian's face contorted. "You can't be serious. You think you can blackmail me? You think my family will let you?" "Your family," Clara interrupted, "will do exactly what Beatrice tells them to do, and Beatrice will do whatever protects the Whitman name. She'll throw you to the wolves, Julian, if it means saving the company. You know she will. You've always known. The silence that followed was immense. Julian stared at her, his face a mask of fury and fear, and the slow, dawning realization that she was right. His mother had spent his entire life valuing the Whitman legacy above everything else, including her own son. If Clara presented her with proof that Julian had been stealing from the company, Beatrice would crucify him herself rather than risk the scandal. "You're a cold woman," Julian said finally. His voice was raw. "I always knew there was something wrong with you. Mother was right. You don't have a drop of class in your entire body." Clara smiled. It was the same smile she had worn at the gala, the same smile she had worn when she negotiated her majority stake, the same smile she had worn for 5 years while the family she had saved treated her like an embarrassment. "No," she said. "I don't, but I have something your mother has never understood. I have power, real power, not the kind you inherit, the kind you build. And by the time I'm done, every Whitman in this city is going to know exactly what that means." The family meeting was convened the following afternoon in the formal sitting room of Beatrice's townhouse. Clara had not requested it. Beatrice had summoned her, the way she summoned everyone, with a terse phone call and the expectation of immediate obedience. Clara had agreed to come. She had dressed carefully for the occasion. A simple black dress, elegant but understated, the kind of armor that whispered rather than shouted. She wore no jewelry except her mother's pearl earrings, small and luminous against her dark hair. The room was full when she arrived. Beatrice sat in her usual chair, a winged armchair upholstered in pale silk, her posture rigid, her face a mask of controlled fury. Julian stood beside her, his expression a mixture of defiance and barely concealed terror. 2 of the board members were present, Harrington and a man named Prescott, both of them looking deeply uncomfortable. And Alexander, Clara's brother-in-law, hovered near the window, his face carefully blank. No one offered Clara a seat. She didn't wait for one. She walked to the center of the room and stood there, her hands clasped loosely before her, her face calm. She looked at Beatrice, at Julian, at the assembled representatives of the family she had married into and spent 5 years trying to belong to. "You wanted to see me," Clara said. "I'm here." Beatrice's eyes were cold. "My son has informed me of your accusations and your threats. I must say, Clara, I'm disappointed. I always knew you were common, but I didn't think you were capable of this level of vulgarity. Attempting to blackmail a Whitman? Using fabricated evidence to destroy a marriage? It's beneath even you." Clara didn't flinch. "The evidence isn't fabricated. Julian has been embezzling from the company for over a year. He's been using the money to fund an affair with Margot Delacour, a woman you personally introduced him to and encouraged him to spend time with. I have receipts, bank records, and photographs. I have a complete forensic accounting of every dollar he took." She reached into her bag and withdrew a slim folder. She held it up, letting them see it. "I also have a draft of the divorce papers. Julian will sign them today. He will resign from Whitman and Company, effective immediately. He will forfeit any claim to the company's assets beyond his personal shares, which, as you know, represent a minority stake. And he will agree to a full, confidential settlement that protects the Whitman name from the scandal of a public trial." The room was silent. Harrington shifted in his chair. Prescott looked at the floor. Julian's face had gone white. Beatrice's expression didn't change. She looked at Clara with the cold, imperious gaze of a woman who had spent her entire life believing that the world would rearrange itself to suit her wishes. "And if we refuse? If we fight this vulgar little ambush of yours?" Clara met her eyes. "Then I take everything public. The embezzlement, the affair, the photographs, the forensic accounting. I release it all to the press, to the shareholders, to the banks that hold your loans. Whitman and Company will be destroyed, not by me, by Julian, by his choices, by your family's refusal to hold him accountable. But I'll be the one who pulls the trigger." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. or you can accept my terms. Julian signs the papers. He resigns quietly. The family keeps the scandal buried, and Whitman and Company continues to operate under new leadership. Leadership that understands what it takes to run a company in the 21st century. Beatrice's lips thinned. And what leadership would that be? Yours? Yes, Clara said simply. Mine. The silence stretched. Julian opened his mouth as if to speak, but Beatrice silenced him with a single raised hand. She looked at Clara for a long, terrible moment, her eyes moving over her daughter-in-law's calm face, her simple dress, her quiet, unshakable composure. You think you've won, Beatrice said finally. Her voice was soft, almost wondering. You think this little performance gives you power, but you don't understand how our world works, Clara. You never have. You can have your divorce, you can have your settlement, but you will never be one of us. You will never be a Whitman. You lack the pedigree. You lack the class. You always will. She leaned forward, her eyes glittering. Just take a small settlement and leave quietly. You should be grateful you got to carry our name for this long. It's more than someone like you could ever have hoped for. Clara looked at her mother-in-law, at the woman who had spent 5 years belittling her, dismissing her, treating her like a stain on the family silk, at the woman who had just told her in front of witnesses that she should be grateful for the privilege of being treated as less than. And Clara smiled. It was a real smile, not the careful, defensive smile she had worn for so many years, but something genuine, something almost radiant, because Beatrice had just given her exactly what she wanted: the divorce, the clean break, the freedom to do what she had been planning for months without the mess of a protracted legal battle. You're right, Beatrice, Clara said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. I'm not classy enough for this family. I never was, and I don't want to be. I want something far more valuable than your name. I want my freedom, and I want what I've earned. She reached into her bag and withdrew a second folder, the divorce papers, already prepared, already signed by her. She held them out to Julian. Sign these, she said, today, now, and I'll walk out of this house and out of your life. The evidence stays buried, the company stays intact, and you can go back to pretending you're the golden heir to a legacy you never earned and never deserved. Julian stared at the papers. His hands were shaking. He looked at his mother, but Beatrice's face was stone. She gave him nothing. He took the pen Clara offered. He signed. Clara gathered the papers, placed them back in her bag, and turned to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back at Beatrice. You said I lack class, Clara said. You're right, I do. But I have something you've never understood, Beatrice. I have competence. I have patience. And I have the legal right to everything I've built. You'll understand what that means soon enough. She walked out of the townhouse and into the pale afternoon light. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the sun on her face, and let herself breathe. She was free. She was finally, completely, irrevocably free of the Whitman family. And now, at last, she could do what she had been planning to do all along. She got into her car and drove to her office. She had a company to claim. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. Beatrice had chosen the time deliberately, believing that an early meeting would catch Clara off guard, would demonstrate the family's continued control over the rhythm of Whitman and Company. She had sent the notice via her personal attorney, a terse email that read simply, "The Whitman family requests your presence at a meeting of the board to discuss the transition of leadership following the dissolution of your marriage to Julian Whitman. Requests your presence." As if Clara were a guest, as if she needed permission to enter a building she had saved from collapse. Clara had read the email 3 times, then she had smiled, the same calm, steady smile she had worn at the gala, at the negotiation, at the divorce signing. She had replied with a single line, "I'll be there." She spent the weekend preparing, not frantically. There was no need for frenzy when the outcome was already determined. She simply reviewed her documents, confirmed the filings with her attorney, and selected her armor. On Monday morning, she rose before dawn, showered, and dressed with the same deliberate care she had brought to every aspect of her quiet campaign. The suit was new. She had bought it 6 months ago, on a day when she had walked past a boutique window and seen it hanging there. A sharp tailored creation in charcoal gray, with a single button blazer and trousers that fell in a clean, elegant line. It was the kind of suit worn by women who didn't need to shout to be heard. Women who owned the room simply by entering it. She wore no Whitman diamonds. The necklace she had left on the marble counter at the gala had been retrieved by Beatrice's assistant and returned to the vault, and Clara had never asked for it back. Instead, she wore her mother's pearl earrings, small, luminous, and utterly without pretense. Her only other jewelry was a simple gold watch that had been a gift from her first boss, a woman who had taught her that power was not something you inherited, but something you built. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back was calm, composed, and completely unrecognizable as the unrefined bride who had spent 5 years smiling through Beatrice's cruelties. That woman was gone. In her place was someone else entirely, Clara Thorne. She had reclaimed her maiden name the day the divorce was finalized. It was a small thing, a line on a form, but it felt like a homecoming. Clara Thorne, the name her mother had given her, the name she had built her early career with, before she traded it for the hollow privilege of being a Whitman. She had been Clara Thorne when she learned to read a balance sheet, when she negotiated her first major contract, when she built a reputation for competence and integrity that the Whitmans had never bothered to learn about. She was Clara Thorne again, and today everyone would know it. The boardroom was already full when Clara arrived. She had timed her entrance carefully, not early, which would have signaled eagerness, and not late, which would have signaled disrespect. She walked through the doors at exactly 9 o'clock, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, her posture straight, her face serene. The long mahogany table was surrounded by familiar faces. Beatrice sat at the head, of course, her iron-gray hair swept into an elaborate coiffure, the Whitman star blazing at her throat like a captured piece of the sky. Julian was beside her, looking pale and tense, his eyes darting toward Clara and then away. The board members, Harrington, Prescott, and 3 others, were arranged around the table, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and anticipation. Alexander was there too, hovering near the window, his face carefully blank. And at the far end of the table, in the seat that had always been reserved for the company's founder, sat a single empty chair. Clara didn't wait to be invited. She walked to the empty chair and sat down. She folded her hands on the polished wood and looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was calm, unhurried. "I believe we have business to discuss." Beatrice's lips thinned. She had clearly expected Clara to sit elsewhere, to defer, to shrink, to acknowledge her diminished status. But Clara had never been good at shrinking. She had simply learned to be patient. "Indeed we do," Beatrice said. Her voice was cold, controlled, the voice of a woman who believed she was still in command. "As you know, the board has been discussing the future leadership of Whitman and Company. Given the unfortunate circumstances of your divorce from my son, it seems appropriate to clarify the chain of command. Julian has graciously agreed to step into the role of chairman, effective immediately. I'm sure you'll join us in congratulating him." She paused, her eyes glittering with barely concealed triumph. Around the table, the board members shifted uncomfortably. Julian straightened in his chair, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. Clara didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply reached into the leather portfolio she had carried in and withdrew a single folder. She placed it on the table. "That won't be possible," she said. Beatrice's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon? Julian cannot assume the role of chairman. He cannot assume any role at this company. As of 9 o'clock this morning, his employment with Whitman and Company, or rather with the entity formerly known as Whitman and Company, has been terminated." She opened the folder and withdrew the first document. It was a copy of the amended operating agreement for Whitman Holdings, LLC, the parent company that controlled all of Whitman and Company's assets. She slid it across the table toward Beatrice. "Under the terms of the performance-based ownership clause that I negotiated 2 years ago, the clause your family agreed to, the clause you personally signed. Beatrice, any shareholder who engages in conduct that materially damages the company's reputation or financial standing forfeits their shares. Julian's embezzlement of company funds, his misuse of company assets to conduct an extramarital affair, and his subsequent confession to those actions constitute a clear violation of the integrity and performance clauses. She withdrew a second document. Julian's signed confession, notarized and legally binding. As of this morning, Julian's shares, 15% of the company, have reverted to me as the majority shareholder. Combined with my existing 51% stake, I now control 66% of the voting shares, a supermajority, sufficient to make any changes I deem necessary without board approval. The room was silent. Julian's face had gone gray. Beatrice stared at the documents, her expression cycling through disbelief, fury, and the first stirrings of genuine fear. "You can't do this," Beatrice whispered. "This company has borne the Whitman name for over a century. You can't just—" "I can." Clara's voice didn't rise. "I did, and I've done more than that." She withdrew a third document. This one was crisp and new, printed on heavy cream-colored paper with an elegant, understated letterhead. She placed it on the table for everyone to see. Clara Thorne Global. The company, formerly known as Whitman & Company, has been rebranded. The legal filings were completed this morning. The website has been updated. The clients have been notified. The Whitman name is no longer associated with this firm in any capacity. Beatrice's hand flew to her throat, clutching the Whitman star as if it might protect her from the reality unfolding before her. The clients, the assets, the legacy. You've stolen everything. You've stolen my family's. I've stolen nothing. Clara's voice was calm, almost gentle. I saved this company from bankruptcy 2 years ago. I injected my own capital, restructured the supply chain, and rebuilt the client relationships your family had spent decades destroying. I did all of this while you dismissed me as common, while you told me I lacked pedigree, while you treated me like a stain on your silk. I earned every share, every asset, every client, and now I'm claiming what I earned. She withdrew a fourth document, a list of the company's major clients, each one annotated with a note confirming their continued relationship with Clara Thorne Global. The clients have been informed of the transition. They've also been informed of the circumstances surrounding Julian's departure. Every single one has chosen to remain with the firm, not because of the Whitman name, because of me, because of the work I've done, the relationships I've built, trust I've earned while your family was busy attending galas and judging other women's pedigrees. She closed the folder and folded her hands on top of it. I'm keeping the business. I'm keeping the assets. I'm keeping the clients. And I'm keeping the building, which I purchased outright 6 months ago through a separate holding company you never knew existed. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. You can keep the name. After all, it's the only thing you have left. The silence that followed was immense. Beatrice sat frozen, her face a mask of devastation. Julian looked like a man who had just watched his entire life collapse in the space of a single conversation. The board members were staring at Clara with expressions that ranged from shock to reluctant admiration, and Alexander, still hovering near the window, had gone very still. "You planned this," Beatrice said finally. Her voice was raw, stripped of its usual imperiousness. "From the beginning. You planned all of this." Clara met her eyes. "No, I didn't plan it. I prepared for it. There's a difference. I came into this family hoping to belong. I loved your son, or I believed I did. I wanted to be part of the Whitman legacy, but you made it clear from the very first day that I would never be welcome. You called me common. You called me unrefined. You told me I lacked class." She stood up, gathering her portfolio. "You were right. I lacked the class that comes from inherited wealth and unquestioned privilege. I lacked the pedigree that comes from being born into a name you didn't earn. But I have something you've never understood, Beatrice. I have competence. I have integrity. I have the ability to build something real, something lasting, something that doesn't depend on a century-old name to give it value. She looked around the table, at the board members, at Julian, at Alexander, at the portraits of dead Whitmans lining the walls. This company will thrive without you. It will grow, innovate, and lead this industry into the future, and it will do so under a name that means something. My name, Clara Thorne, the name of a woman who built her own legacy brick by brick, while the people who dismissed her watched their own crumble. She turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. Julian, your personal effects from the office will be delivered to your mother's townhouse by the end of the week. Beatrice, I've taken the liberty of having the Whitman Star appraised. It's worth approximately $4 million. I'm not interested in it. You may keep it, along with the rest of the family jewelry, as a reminder of what you lost, and what you could have had if you had chosen differently. She met Beatrice's eyes one last time. You told me I lacked class. You were right, but I have something far more valuable. I have the power you spent your entire life pretending to possess, and I earned every ounce of it. She walked out of the boardroom. The door closed behind her with a soft final click. The elevator carried her down to the lobby. She walked through the marble foyer, past the reception desk where Elise sat with wide, awed eyes, and out into the pale morning light. The city hummed around her, indifferent to the small drama that had just concluded in a boardroom above the streets. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the sun on her face, and let herself breathe. She was free. She was finally, completely, irrevocably free of the Whitman family, and she was the sole owner of a company that would never bear their name again. She thought about her mother, about the pearl earrings she wore, small and luminous, about the woman who had taught her that power was not something you inherited, but something you built, about the quiet, patient love that had never asked her to be small. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered, "for everything." Then she walked to her car and drove to her new office, the corner office on the top floor, the one that had once belonged to Beatrice's father. It was hers now. All of it was hers. The business, the assets, the clients, the future. And she was going to build something extraordinary.